Most people recognize Brian De Palma from classic films such as Scarface, Mission Impossible, or Carlito's Way. Today, however, I'd like to discuss one of his other quintessential films, Carrie. Now let me ask you this. When is the last time you thought of Carrie White as a Disney princess? If you're of any sane mind, the answer is probably never. But let's assume for a second that you have. Did you ever consider that Disney princess to be Rapunzel? No, of course not. Of course you didn't. But in this video, I'm going to explain to you how Brian De Palma's Carrie is the exact same movie as Disney's Tangled. First, it's probably going to be pretty important that you've seen both of these movies, so I'll give you a chance right now to pause the video and go watch them. That's great. Now that you're back, we can get into the plots of the movie and start figuring out their similarities. Carrie is a 1976 horror thriller film following the title character Carrie White as she navigates the tumultuous days of high school living. Carrie seems to be the punching bag and the laughingstock of all the popular girls in her grade. Without going over all of the details of the film, I'm sure you already are familiar with the iconic pig's blood scene at the prom. All of this heartbreak, let's not forget, is only supported by the corrupted Jesus-loving personality of Carrie's mother, Margaret. It is that same dedication to Jesus that gets the White household dragged down to hell in the climax of the film. On a lighter note, you'd suspect, we have Disney's Tangled. Tangled is a 2010 Disney princess film following a kidnapped Rapunzel in her attempt to get back to her parents, the king and the queen. However, the catch is, Rapunzel doesn't quite know that she's their daughter. And with the help of the enticing Flynn Rider, the two escape Rapunzel's tower and make it back to the castle. However, just like Carrie, there is a conniving mother hiding in the background waiting to spoil everybody's plans. Mother Gothel is not only responsible for kidnapping Rapunzel and keeping her from her parents, but also forcing Rapunzel through fear to never ever leave that tower. I'm pretty sure I can guess what you're thinking right now. This guy has no idea what he's talking about. He just went over the plots of Carrie and Tangled and missed the one glaring similarity between the two. Carrie White and Rapunzel both have unnatural abilities. Don't worry, I didn't forget, I'm getting there. Now, to deeper understand the connection between the two movies, we need to go over the main characters of the films. To do that, I'm going to go over 3 from each. They are Carrie White and Rapunzel, Margaret White and Mother Gothel, and Tommy Ross and Flynn Rider. Let's start with the hunks, Tommy and Flynn. Tommy and Flynn serve as the love interests for the film's main character, only meeting the main character under circumstances that wouldn't seem to fit the film's narrative initially. Tommy only begins speaking to Carrie after his girlfriend Sue asks him to take her to the prom, and Flynn only meets Rapunzel after climbing into her tower in an attempt to escape the law. The two are seemingly not the right matches for our leading ladies, yet as the film progresses, each pair begins falling for each other more and more. The important detail here is that as Tommy and Flynn become more and more enamored with Carrie and Rapunzel, their ideas for their original plot lessen. That is, Tommy becomes less interested in Sue, and Flynn becomes less interested in regaining the tiara that he stole. However, blinded by love, the two men become pawns in an antagonist's plot to ruin everything. Tommy in Christine's plan to serve as a distraction so that she can dump pig's blood on Carrie, and Flynn being tied down in the rowboat by Mother Gothel in an attempt to make Rapunzel believe that he leaves her. Now, we'll come back to these guys in just a minute, but first, let's talk about the evil moms, Margaret White and Mother Gothel. In Tangled, we learned very early on all about Mother Gothel's backstory. However, in Carrie, it's not that simple. We know that Mother Gothel wanted to find the Sundrop flower in an attempt to stay young forever. The youthful properties of that flower were then taken and given to the queen as she gave birth to Rapunzel, thus transferring the power onto Rapunzel's ever-growing hair. The enticing desire to stay young then led Mother Gothel to kidnap baby Rapunzel and trap her in the tower. Margaret White's story, though, isn't as straightforward. Through quick lines of dialogue and short context clues, the audience can assume that Margaret had Carrie before she was married. And clearly, as Margaret believes through her love of the Bible, this is a definite no-go. This is where we start discussing the girl's unnatural powers once again. Like I mentioned a second ago, Rapunzel gains her power through the Sundrop flower. Carrie, on the other hand, as Margaret would have you believe, her gift is that of Satan, solely as a punishment to Margaret for having a child before marriage. What's important to notice here is that both mothers rule their daughters' lives through fear, whether that be the fear of going outside in general, or the fear of being ridiculed by others at school. While the girls are being held captive, it's also crucial to understand their worldviews are being shaped in the ideas of their mother, meaning that Carrie and Rapunzel have no opportunities to make decisions for themselves because they simply do not have the intelligence about the real world to do so. The girls' lack of knowledge and awareness is made evident in a couple of scenes, specifically for Carrie, in the very beginning while she's in the girls' locker room, and for Rapunzel, when she desires nothing more to see the lights, yet does not know even what those lights signify. Or even better, when Flynn Rider finds his way into the tower and she has no idea what to do with him besides whack him with a frying pan. The two girls have been so drowned in the ideals of their mothers that they have no agency for themselves. Yet only when they do take this agency for themselves, as we'll discuss in a minute, is truly when they begin to take on their own character. This can only be attributed to the mother's selfish desire to keep the daughters for themselves. And finally, yes, the mothers do die. Interestingly enough, however, both of them die at the hands of their daughters' gifts. Margaret dies in a telekinetic outrage that has their house dragged to hell, and Mother Gothel essentially becomes vaporized when Flynn Rider cuts Rapunzel's hair, voiding it of all of its previous power. Talking about the mothers is great, but honestly, that's probably not why you're here. You're here to talk about the main event, Carrie White and Rapunzel. There's so much to talk about when comparing these two main characters, but let's begin by talking about how their world is shaped by their mother. As I said before, Carrie and Rapunzel are both young and naive, yet through no fault of their own. It's only through the duplicitous nature of their mothers that they simply cannot gain the knowledge to form their own view of the outside world. This is why Tommy Ross and Flynn Rider are so important. Not only do they provide the conduit to the outside world, but they give Carrie and Rapunzel that little push that gets them out the door and into the great wide open. Tommy in getting Carrie to finally agree to go to the prom, and Flynn in getting Rapunzel to finally climb out of the tower and touch grass. And in the same way that their mothers build their own personality based on their daughters' gifts, the daughters do the same thing. Their entire personality is built around the fact that they can move things with their minds or make people young with their hair. Again, this social class definition that is attributed to both of the daughters is only defined by what the mother sees when she looks at her specific daughter. Margaret only sees her infidelity when she looks at Carrie and her ability of telekinesis, and Mother Gothel only sees the age that she would turn into if she lost Rapunzel. In a way, the mothers define their own lives by fear. It's not quite the same fear that they instill within their daughters, the fear of joining a society or making friends. It's more so a fear defined by the daughter's gift, Mother Gothel of getting old, and Margaret being reminded of the impure acts that she had in her youth. Coming back to the climaxes of both films, it's here that I touch again on the deaths of the mothers. Carrie and Rapunzel go through a list of characters that either help or harm them on their journey throughout their films. However, it's at the end, near the deaths of the mothers, that the girls find out that the person who betrays them is the person who they ultimately thought would be their biggest advocate. Of course, Rapunzel spent the first 16 years of her life believing that Mother Gothel was her real mother, and Carrie White imagined that her mother Margaret would never steer her in the wrong direction, never withhold information. And yet, even when Carrie begins to believe that her mother was right about society, Margaret is the one that attacks Carrie with a kitchen knife. It becomes an ironic situation when you find out that the women that wanted to keep the daughters away from society were the same ones that pushed them towards it with their own actions. Once Carrie and Rapunzel experience what society is like, experience how nice society can be to them, only then do they gain the desire to rebel against their mothers. It just so happens that these situations coincide perfectly with the mothers betraying their daughters. Now comes the final point worth noting, the conclusion of the films. I believe that some people would say this is where my argument would fall apart. However, I'm here to tell you right now that while yes, the tone of the film's endings are different, stylistically, they are again the same. Let's look at Carrie first. Following an explosion of death at the prom where she burns the building down and kills everybody inside, she walks home, where she ends up killing her mother and telekinetically dragging her house down to hell. Pretty grim ending, right? Now let's look at Tangled. Flynn comes up on Rapunzel's tower only to find that she's been bound by Mother Gothel. Seeing nothing but Rapunzel, Flynn Rider doesn't notice Mother Gothel coming up behind him to stab him in the back. As Flynn lays dying, Rapunzel attempts to save him with her hair, only to find her hair being cut by a shard of glass by Flynn Rider himself. This turns all of Rapunzel's hair brown, nullifying it of all of its powers as Mother Gothel turns to dust while falling out of the window. But with Tangled, there's a little bit more. Rapunzel and Flynn then go back to the kingdom, where they're welcomed as heroes and long-lost friends. The king and the queen welcome their daughter and Flynn Rider. Flynn and Rapunzel get married and live their happily ever after. Very heartwarming. Much more than a house being dragged to hell, no pun intended. So what's there to compare besides the mothers dying by the hands of their daughter? Someone being sentenced to an eternity in hell doesn't quite seem the same as a happily ever after, right? Well, you are right. Just take one more second to hear me out though. Both Carrie and Rapunzel, through their actions in the entire film, end up exactly where they deserve to be. Rapunzel has been in captivity for 16 years, and albeit unknowingly. Therefore, she deserves her happy ending. She deserves to be back with her parents in the kingdom and be the kingdom's most beloved princess there ever was. On top of that, through a lifetime of isolation, don't you think she deserves to be with Flynn Rider, the one true love of her life? Carrie White, though, doesn't really get her happy ending. If we look back at the prom scene, we find that really only a handful of students are responsible for the embarrassment of Carrie. Now, I'm not condoning their behavior, but Carrie certainly has some sort of problem with seeing everybody laughing at her. It's in this rage that realizing that her mother may have been right, that she burns down the entire school with everyone in it. This might feel like a you go girl moment at the time of watching the film, but really, she just murdered hundreds of innocent teenagers and teachers. It is only when she walks home, kills her mother, and brings her house down that, if Margaret is to be believed, Carrie is where she finally belongs, in hell. And I don't think this is much of a stretch either, considering Margaret literally just tried to kill her only daughter with a kitchen knife. Yes, Carrie was the victim in most of her situations, but again, going off of the assumptions of Margaret White, Carrie White's power comes directly from the devil himself. Therefore, it only makes sense that she ends her life going back to him. In no way am I saying this is a happy ending, but personally, I think it was the only way to end this near masterpiece of a film. So really, what does this mean in the grand landscape of cinematic history? Effectively nothing. Believe me, I genuinely thank you for it, but you've just sat here for 10 plus minutes listening to me ramble about my crazy movie conspiracy theories. But don't you think it's fun to imagine that there was a huge Brian De Palma fan in the writer's room of Tangled? I think arguments like this prove that genre is not as solid as a foundation as some people might think that it is. Sure, it has its defining features, but there are ins and outs of every genre that connect it to every other genre. It's a fluid system that keeps people's love for films alive and ever-changing. So was Carrie White a Disney princess? No, of course not. Sure, Carrie and Tangled are both very tragic stories with wildly different endings, but that doesn't discount their similarities in the slightest. And if I still haven't convinced you, I'd encourage you to think about these two films in a way that maybe you've never thought of before. And if you need a little bit more inspiration, be sure to check out my other video essays just like this one. Let me know which crazy different movies you think are the same, and I'll catch you in the next one.